Hello everyone, welcome to Drishti IAS. You're watching the NCERT Foundational Series wherein we study the subject of polity or political science with the help of MCQs and PYQs wherever relevant. Now today we are going to be starting with your Class 10 NCERT, which is also titled Democratic Politics, like its Class 9 counterpart. So without further ado, let's plunge in. Now I have brought to you a quick glance into what we'll be covering today. So like I said, we're going to be starting with Class 10 NCERT with the very first chapter, which is titled Power Sharing. And with the help of MCQs that I've brought for you today, we're going to be discussing the meaning of power sharing, why power sharing is needed or is desirable, and what are the forms of or the various means of power sharing. So this is actually the summary of your entire chapter. This sums up your entire chapter and we'll be covering that with the help of MCQs today. Before that, let's quickly look at the previous day question. Consider the following pairs where on one side you have a list of rights and on the other side you have corresponding constitutional safeguards. We have to figure which of the pairs given above are correctly matched, right? Let's take it one by one. First, right to information derived from Article 19(1)(a). Freedom of speech and expression. Notice the term derived. Okay. This means that it is not explicitly stated in the Constitution but rather derived. It is derivative of this right. Now, this right was derived in a case which is State of UP versus Raj Narayan. So, and this was a case in 1975. In this case, it was ruled that right to information is implicit in the right to freedom of speech and expression. Even though not explicitly mentioned, it is embedded in this right. Alright, hence it is correctly matched. Second says right to food and expanded meaning of Article 21, right to life and personal liberty. Now again, it says expanded meaning, which automatically leads us to think that it is not mentioned originally in the said right, alright? And this is actually true. Now, when I say expanded meaning, in this particular case, it actually means interpretative expansion. Interpretative expansion. What is interpretative? That the Supreme Court interpreted the article and then expanded it to include right to food. Which case are we talking about here? Please remember, this happened in the case known as PUCL versus Union of India. People's Union for Civil Liberties versus Union of India 2001. And that's where Article 21 was interpreted and expanded to include right to food. Now, so this is absolutely correct. Let's look at the third pairing, right to education, Article 21(a), free and compulsory education for children 6 to 14 years. Of course, now this is actually added in the Constitution. There is no derivation here, there is no corollary here. It is simply, it was added, explicitly added to the Constitution by the 86th Amendment Act of 2002. Alright, so this also happens to be correctly matched. Hence, option D is our correct answer. I really hope all of this is clear to you. Now let's begin with the very first question of our Class 10 Chapter 1, Power Sharing. In the context of democracy, power sharing primarily refers to. Now, please notice that we are again talking about the context of democracy. Our very initial original session was based on the concept of democracy, right? And where we discuss democracy, the whole idea is that that people elect their representatives, the rulers, all right. So basically, people are the source of all political power, all right. This is the very fundamental principle of democracy. Now, when we talk about power sharing, we know that all people are the source of political power. Hence, it would be unfair to concentrate that power in the few hands, limited hands of a few citizens, all right. So, this concept of power sharing came into being, and this can be understood again in very simple terms as the distribution of power, between what? Between different organs and levels of government, between different organs, right? Levels of government as well as social groups, right? So, of course, government is there, government is the elected representative, but also the social groups, the people, the community that makes it all a well-oiled machinery. So, power needs to be provided to them as well, so that democracy functions smoothly, so that democracy runs smoothly, all right. So, this is basically the very fundamental definition or idea of power sharing in the simplest of terms, which is basically the distribution of power between the different organs of government, the different levels of government, as well as different social groups or interest groups or pressure groups or political parties. A lot of things come under these, all right, so that democracy can run smoothly. This is a very basic concept. Now, notice that I use the term different levels of government and different organs of government. These are separate concepts, but we'll come to that as we proceed, all right. Now, let's try and look at the option. Power sharing means distribution of natural resources among all citizens. No, we just discussed it's about distribution of power and privileges. Allocation of power among different organs, levels and groups to avoid concentration. This is a key word here, okay, so that democracy can function effectively. If power is concentrated, then democracy, actually the purpose gets defeated, because we are focusing on the principle of people being the source of all political power, all right. Option C says transfer of authority from the legislature to the executive. No, this is not power sharing. D, ensuring economic equality through redistribution. Again, this is not power sharing, but rather redistribution or some sort of welfareism, all right. So, we have our correct answer, which is option number B. Question 2. Consider the following statements regarding the desirability of power sharing in a democracy. Notice the word desirability. Desirability means why power sharing is important in a society. 1. It reduces the possibility of social conflict and enhances political stability by preventing the imposition of majority will. Now, before we move ahead, let me quickly summarize over here what exactly is written in terms of power sharing in your NCERT and its desirability, okay. Now, let's consider 2 reasons or 3 reasons very quickly why power sharing is necessary. First, power sharing avoids conflicts, or let me take a fresh page. So, this is power sharing, and we are discussing why this is desirable in a democracy. Now, first of all, if power is shared, conflicts can be avoided, right? Because if there are conflicts related to power, then there will be a lot of violence. If there is violence, then there will be political instability, right? So, in order to stabilize the polity, In order to stabilize the political setup, it is desirable that power be shared equitably, not equally. I'm talking about the word equitably, okay, in reasonable manner between all different sections of the society and different sections of the government as well. All right. And in the long run, if conflicts are avoided and the political setup is stabilized, then of course there will be no threat to the unity of the country and it will be preserved as well. All right. Another reason, and I would say a rather more important reason, is that of the very principle of democracy, right? The very principle of democracy talks about how it is inherently necessary to share power. Any legitimate government will make sure that all citizens participate and become stakeholders in governance, right? In any legitimate democracy, it is desirable that all citizens should participate. You remember we talked about every person having the right to vote, every person having the equal right to vote, as well as every person's vote being of equal value, right? So of course, every citizen in a legitimate democracy should be a participating stakeholder. All right. Now, these reasons that are based on outcomes, that the outcome of power sharings are going to be positive, for example, conflict avoidance, for example, political stability, and so on. These reasons can be called prudential reasons, okay, because they are outcome based. There is nothing innately or inherently good about these. They are based on outcomes, good outcomes though. And these reasons, and this one reason particularly, which talks about the very innate quality of democracy to have citizens as participating stakeholders, this particular reason is the moral reason. Moral reason for why power sharing should be promoted or accepted. So let's go after this discussion to the first statement. It reduces the possibility of social conflict and enhances political stability by preventing the imposition of majority will, of course, right? So power sharing is basically protecting the minority interest from the tyranny of the majority. We discussed it even while we were discussing democracy, that if the ruler is so powerful that they are chosen by the will of the people, it is very likely that without certain safeguards, without certain checks and balances and constitutional provisions, they are likely to turn tyrannical. All right. So here, and they're likely to override other people's interests, perhaps the minority's interests. So this is absolutely correct, and this is one of the prudential reasons. Okay. Second option says, in the long term, power sharing can undermine national unity if it prioritizes minority interests over collective goals. Absolutely not. In the long term, on the contrary, it is going to preserve and enhance unity. This is what we discussed. Preserve and enhance unity. How? By avoiding conflicts, by resolving conflicts and avoiding them in the first place, right? So this statement is wrong. Third point says it fosters a sense of legitimacy by ensuring citizens participate and acquire a stake in governance. Now this is absolutely right. We just discussed it as the moral reason for power sharing. All right. So we know that 1 and 3 are correct. Therefore, option B is your correct answer. Question 3, which of the following is ensured by the horizontal distribution of power? Now, this again is a very important concept that we should clarify. So, we are talking over here about forms of power sharing. All right. We are talking about the forms of power sharing. In what ways can power be shared? Now, power can be shared, like I said, amongst different organs of the government, right? Different organs of the government. What are the organs of the government? There is the legislative, the legislature, then there is the executive, and then there is the judiciary. So these are the three organs: legislature, executive, and judiciary. All these three organs are placed at the same level. All right, they are at the same level, which means no particular organ has more power. No organ, no one organ is superior to the others. No one organ has the ultimate authority or the supreme power. All are at the same level. And if one of these organs trespass their jurisdiction, okay, then the others can keep them in check and balance that power, that overreach of power. All right. So here we are following the principles of checks and balances. So there is separation of power. All these organs are at the same level and no one is superior to the other, right? And suppose there is an overreach in the exercise of power, then we follow the principle of checks and balances. How? So for example, legislature is overreaching in some way, probably by enacting laws that are not in the best interest of the citizens. Who's going to put a check? Judiciary, right? They're going to declare that law as unconstitutional and void. Or if executive is being tyrannical or authoritarian and not paying heed to the aspirations of the people, then again, judiciary can come to the rescue, or in the legislature, what can happen? A no confidence motion against the executive can be passed, right? So this is how all these organs are constantly balancing and checking each other. So this is known as the horizontal form of power sharing. Now there's another form of power sharing which talks about different levels of government. Okay, now we are talking about a bit of hierarchy here. Now, especially in India, but in a lot of other countries, there is what usually a union or a central government, right, which takes care of the entire nation, matters of national importance. All right, this is followed by what? Either regional or what you may call better provincial, right? Provincial governments. Now in different countries they have different names. In India we call them state governments. All right. So here we call them state governments. Now they have matters that are relevant to local administration, state level administration. All right. And then again we have local level of government. At least in India they are in the form of panchayats and urban local bodies, right? So there's that. So we see that there is a different level of government at each tier, and each level of government has specific functions, most or all of which are specified in the constitution, right? So we can say that this is vertical power sharing, vertical division of power, also better known as federal division of powers. This is very important, and this we are going to discuss in detail in the next chapter, in your chapter 2, federalism. All right. Now there's another two more ways in which power can be shared. One in the form of social groups, another in the form of political parties, interests or pressure groups, all right, these, or some movements as well. So there are various movements that keep happening in order to influence the government and have more say in the government. So now social groups, when we talk about it, let's consider the example of India. In India, the constitution provides reservation to socially and historically marginalized groups such as SCs, STs, women, right? So particularly in India, these are an example of how social groups also play a part in power sharing, okay? Or they are also a form of power sharing, of course, because through reservations, they are getting a fair share of power, all right? And fourth is political parties, interest groups and movements. Now, when we talk about political parties, this power sharing, the phenomenon of power sharing actually leads to a competition, political party competition, right? Because there's so many sections, those who want to be represented in politics. So since there are many sections that want to be represented, there are going to be as many political parties, all right? So this leads to competition. But what is the good thing about this competition is that there is no concentration of power. There is no concentration of power. One party cannot keep winning the elections and has a fair chance of losing the elections. So there is no concentration of power over here, and competition means different parties who are able to better perform and fulfill the aspirations of the people get a chance to keep forming the government again and again. Now again, another way they can have a share in the power is by forming coalition, either a pre-poll alliance, right? Sometimes coalitions also happen after after elections. So this is also one way of sharing power. Also, there is something called interest groups. So there are various groups, for example, groups of workers, industrial workers, farmers, other industrialists, all right, which try to influence the government policies, right? So, because of course, farmers would want certain decisions to be taken that favor them, or industrial workers would want certain decisions or certain policies to be made that are in the interest of these people, right? So, here in this case, they also exert an influence on government policies and therefore claim a share of power. So let's go back to our question. We are here talking about what is ensured by the horizontal distribution of power. When we talk about horizontal distribution of power, please remember legislature, executive and judiciary at the same level. And what do these make sure of? Speedy implementation of laws? Not really, because every time a law comes out, it's very likely that it's going to be highly scrutinized by the public and therefore being sent to the judiciary. So the process is really not speedy at all. Balance of power through a system of checks and balances, absolutely correct. This is what we discussed. Supremacy of the executive, no, we discussed that no one organ is superior to the other. Authority of a single community over decision making. Again, this is what we are trying to avoid. So the correct answer is option B. Question 4, vertical division of power is also known as, we just discussed, it is known as the federal division of power. So the correct answer is option C. So just for the sake of discussion, separation of powers, we've discussed the 3 organs. Even though there is no strict separation of powers, but there is a system of checks and balances. There is consociational democracy. So basically, this means that different groups, okay, come together to form a government, and usually these are antagonist groups. So they are not very much in agreement with each other's policies or ideologies, but they still come together to form a government. Now this is not the vertical sharing of power. Federal, like we said, is the correct answer. Coalition government, we've just discussed a few moments ago. It just simply means that there is an alliance between two parties which decide to form a government. All right. Which of the following is an example of power sharing among social groups? A. Reservation of seats for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in legislatures. This is absolutely correct. We just discussed it when we talked about the third form of power sharing, and in India particularly, reservations are an example of it. All right. B. Parliament controlling the executive. No. This is definitely not power sharing in any way. C. Distribution of power between union and state governments. This would be a federal distribution. And D. Coalition government. This would be in the form of political parties or interest groups, right? The fourth way of sharing power. Question 6. Power sharing through competition among political parties ensures that. Now, we discussed a while ago that when we are talking about power sharing through competition between political parties, it makes sure that not a single political party remains in power perpetually, and that people have alternates from which to choose who their next ruler is going to be. All right. So let's see what that ensures. A. Power remains concentrated in a single party. Absolutely not. This was the first thing we negated. B. Citizens have freedom to choose among alternatives. Absolutely. There is actually real choice. Remember, in the first lecture, we talked about free and fair elections, and we talked about free elections being where the citizens have actual choice, the voters have actual choice, and fair elections where the ruling party has an actual chance of losing the elections. So here, we are also talking about that. All right. See, social groups do not get representation. On the contrary, if there is more political competition, it's very likely that different social groups are going to come together and form more political parties. D. Judiciary dominates the legislature. Now, this is irrelevant to our discussion here. So, the correct answer happens to be option B again. Which of the following is an example of checks and balances in India? Checks and balances, wherever this word arises, kindly remember horizontal sharing of power and between the LEJ, the three organs of our government. A. Judiciary striking down unconstitutional laws passed by the parliament. Is this an example of checks and balances? Very well, it is. B. Reservation of seats for women in panchayats. Now, this is power sharing for social groups. This is an example of the third form of power sharing that we discussed. C. Creation of union and state governments under the constitution. The second form, the federal or vertical division of power that we discussed. And D. Coalition governments at the center. This is form 4, which is political parties and interest groups and movements. All right. So we have our correct answer, which is option A. I hope this is clear to you. This is a fairly straightforward chapter with fairly, I would say, relatively easy questions. In absence of power sharing, democracies are more likely to face. What happens if there is no sharing of power? And you can take examples from the current scenario, historical scenarios, and your NCERT actually mentions the example of Sri Lanka. Kindly go back and read it, where there was no power sharing and there was there's still an ongoing crisis. But of course, it has relatively subsided now But until 2009, there was a condition of civil war there. So what happens in the absence of power sharing? Higher GDP growth? Unlikely, because there's going to be political instability, and therefore economy is also going to suffer if there's political instability. Always know that. B, social conflicts and political instability. Yes, absence of power sharing is going to lead to this. Stronger coalition governments? No. Coalition governments are an example of power sharing. So if there is no power sharing, there's going to be no stronger coalition governments. And D, decline of bureaucracy. Well, actually, no, because decline of bureaucracy has to do with implementation of policies, or rather non-implementation of policies. So if there is no power sharing altogether, the bureaucracy is going to be authoritarian, because the government is going to be authoritarian. All right. So we have our correct answer, which is option B. The concept of majoritarianism in a democracy implies A, equal representation of all communities in government. Of course, when we are talking about this term, we are talking about majority. This is clear from the very nature of the word. The very word itself indicates that, of course, this has to do with majority. Now, a lot of you might be thinking, but is not democracy the rule of the majority principally? So, yes, let's try and understand. So, there is majority rule, okay, and there is majoritarianism. Rule of the majority is actually fair if there are constitutional safeguards. So if there are constitutional safeguards to check unlimited power, all right, then there is no issue with a majority rule. And this is what happens even in a legitimate, perfectly elected democracy, right? But we are talking over here about majoritarianism. Now that becomes a problem because it involves overriding minority interests, okay? So this has to do with overriding minority interests, which means the will of the majority is going to be imposed on everybody, on the minority as well. Whereas what happens, take our country as an example, even though there is a majority rule, there are constitutional safeguards in the form of articles 29 and 30 for the protection of minorities. We just discussed it in the previous session, right? Here that will not happen. So majoritarianism in a democracy does not imply equal representation. The majority community ruling by disregarding minority wishes. Yes, that is the whole idea, the disregarding of minority wishes and needs. C, power sharing arrangements that prioritize minority needs. No. And D, division of power among different levels of government to prevent conflicts. Absolutely not. These are all positive things. Whereas when we talk about majoritarianism, it has a negative connotation. The correct answer over here is option B again. The last question, with reference to community-based power sharing, consider the following. Now, when we are talking about community-based power sharing, we are actually referring to the third part here, social groups, which may also be known as community sharing, or rather we can say that community-based power sharing is actually a part of the third form of power sharing that we discussed, which is social groups, all right? And when we talk about community based, we are actually mainly talking about minorities and their interests, okay? Now let's see. The statement asks us to know which one is not correct. So first statement says it allows elected bodies for specific groups to handle cultural and educational issues, fostering autonomy. We discussed it even in the preceding lecture that if we discuss or if we talk about articles 29 and 30 in part 3 fundamental rights of our constitution, they're actually regarding protecting minority interests and therefore giving them autonomy. So this one is actually correct. So we can eliminate this. Why? Because it is asking which is not correct. Now, the second statement says such models ensure no single community dominates unilaterally but require constitutional safeguards for equality. Sufficiently discussed. This is correct, but the question wants not correct. We'll eliminate this. Third, they are incompatible with federal systems as they overlap with vertical power division. It says incompatible. Let's come back to India. We have a federal division of power, right? We have union government, state governments, and then we have the local governments as well in the forms of panchayats and municipalities. And we also have constitutional safeguards for the protection of minorities, especially under Article 29 and 30. Are these in conflict or are they incompatible? No, they are coexistent and peacefully, that too. They are not mutually exclusive. So this sentence is wrong, which means for the purpose of our question, this is our correct statement and hence we have the correct answer, which again in this case is option B. Now before we move ahead, let me bring to your attention the NCERT online course by Drishti IAS for your UPSC foundation. Now the course provides 150 plus classes as well as 2 years of validity, which means you can access the course for 2 years. The admissions are now open for the course and so you can please go and check the course out. The key point over here is that if you visit any of our offline physical centers for enrolling into the IAS Foundation Classroom course, then the amount that you've paid for this NCERT online course will be waived off. You will receive a full fee waiver. For more information, kindly check the link in the description box or you could call at 87501 87501. Now let's move on to the practice question. I have for you a list which has the forms of power sharing as well as another list which discusses the examples of these forms and you have to match these correctly. So this should not be very difficult for you because we've thoroughly discussed it. So if you liked today's session and solving the MCQs and if you understood the concepts, please like, share and subscribe. Thanks for watching.
For more informative content, like, share and subscribe, and do not forget to press the bell icon to get the notifications.